At dusk the mountain swallowed the last colors of the day. The sugarcane fields lay still, their thin leaves silvering in the violet light, the cicadas just beginning to thrum. On the southern flank, in a village where the roofs sat low and the dogs slept in doorways, people lifted their eyes to a silhouette that had always been there, so constant it was in their bones. Kanlaon breathed in. The air tightened, a pressure with no wind, like the hush before a typhoon, but drier, metallic on the tongue. At the foot of the volcano, a tricycle driver named Armin waited by the sari-sari store for one last fare up the provincial road. His radio chattered with the usual evening talk. A price for diesel in La Carlotta, the rumor of rain, an old story about the year the ash fell and turned the mangoes bitter. He stared up to where the summit crater glowed an unmoving black. He had grown up under that crown. Everyone had. They called it an old king sometimes, a guardian other times. He thought about the warning signs staked along the highway permanent danger zone. 4 kilometers. He had never crossed the line. Others had. They told stories around roasted corn. A sudden blast in '96, they said, the mountain erupting without a whisper of lava, throwing steam and rock and killing 3 climbers near the rim. Phreatic, the radio said. Steam flashing to stone. He remembered a guide named Lena, who kept small photographs in a tin edge-worn, showing a crisp morning on the crater's lip, and then the smoke like torn cloth. She still came down to sell orchids by the market, and every time the earth trembled even a little, she flinched. On a concrete hill in Kanlaon City, inside a low, bright room with humming air conditioners, and walls lined with whiteboards, the instruments began to murmur. A seismologist bent over a monitor, watching the line jump in tiny nervous flicks. Tremor, not the bang of an earthquake, but the continuous vibration of something moving, grinding, boiling underground. There had been weeks of this. Elevated sulfur in the air above the summit. When the wind allowed the sensors to catch it, swarms of small quakes too faint for the villages, but clear in the needle's black crawl summit deformation, measured in millimeters. The agency had kept its warnings simple and clear. Stay away from the 4-kilometer zone. Be ready. The volcano is restless. A boy in Barangay Sagaing ran out into the yard because the dog leapt and bolted for the door. He cupped his hands to sip water from the tap. The water tasted like a coin. His grandmother swatted his shoulder and told him not to waste it. She had been listening to the radio, to the same careful voice she had heard for years. A crisp, thoughtful Filipino accent, explaining what to do and not do when a mountain wakes. Move the chickens in, close the windows, stay calm. But her hands shook slightly as she stacked plastic chairs by the doorway. On the mountain's fractured crown, a light appeared. Not a light in uncolor, a dim smear in the dusk that hinted at heat. Someone with a phone in a rice paddy faced the summit and started filming. The camera shuddered as the ground shivered. A deep subsonic crack shot through the spine of the island, felt more than heard, like the sound of a giant door slamming in the earth. It lifted the hair on the arms of people who had never been near a volcano, except in postcards. Birds rose in one impossible sheet, turning the low hills into a fluttering black river. Armin threw the trike into gear. The summit split. There was no lava, no red river. There was water and steam and rock turning into a furious engine. The crater exhaled a column of ash and gas and pulverized stone that unfurled into the darkening sky and lit itself from within. Forks of white fire crawled through the plume, volcanic lightning, looping and leaping like veins beneath skin. The column rose fast, fast enough to conjure wind where there had been none, sucking the air from the edges of the fields. Dogs howled. People clutched doorframes as pressure spilled through the neighborhoods, an invisible weight hurting ears and teeth, making babies shriek. On the monitors, the tremor went smooth and strong. No more jittery teeth, just a long, unwavering surge. The staff made calls. A man with eyes like dusk opened the door, listened to his own building hum, and then said the words no one wanted to hear into a radio used to flood alerts and typhoon notices. He used the older name, careful, respectful. Kanlaon is erupting. The phrase seemed to move faster than sound, crossing the island in lagging bursts of voice, reaching the soldiers at an outpost halfway up the slope, the school principal in La Castellana counting heads at an evening program, the priest kneeling in a pew where the windows trembled. On the southern flanks, the ash began to fall. It came like dirty snow at first, flakes settling on banana leaves and plastic wash basins, tasting of sulfur. The smell curled into kitchens and made people cough. In the scabbard gullies carved by years of rain, a dark finger of ash and hot debris began to slide, quiet at first, as if hidden, then gathering speed hot, heavy air carrying stones and sand and the stripped bones of plants. It found a path and took it, dropping into ravines that felt the mountains cough more directly than any town could. It steamed where it touched moisture. It whispered the most dangerous words a landscape can say. Down I come. Armin swerved around a jeepney, pulled onto the shoulder. The driver was standing in the road, his mouth moving, pointing up. The sky flickered with lightning, trapped inside the column. The road curved once, twice. A girl ran kabot, a bundle under her arm, calachuchi flowers shaking in her hair. He braked. She threw herself into the sidecar and grabbed the metal bar so hard her knuckles whitened. He didn't ask. He just drove. In the monitoring room, someone muttered about pyroclastic density currents, those suffocating, boiling air avalanches that could hug the slopes and scour the flanks. The thought stuck like a burr. Outside, the wind changed direction and the ash began blowing west. The sugarcane hissed like something alive under rain. Someone shouted that the electricity was going, that there would be no light soon. In the plaza, a grandmother pulled a child into a tricycle and yelled for the driver to get moving. Now, now, as the ash thickened and the mountain's roar deepened into a steady peal. The ash darkened the headlights, the dust floating in beams. In the distance, the crater's glow sharpened around the edges, and from the great dark mass at the mountain's base came a deeper sound the sound people in these islands know too well. A long, low roar like freight cars not made by any machine. Then, as if flicked by a great hand, the town's lights went out. The blackout rolled through the streets like a wave, swallowing neon, corrugated tin shadows, the weak flicker of televisions. The mountain didn't disappear. It became the sky. Lightning rippled through the ash column in trembling veins, and the roar grew muscular, layered, the sound of different avalanches talking over each other. Armin leaned over his handlebars and put the tricycle on the center line, trusting a pale stripe he could barely see, ash popping like blown dust against the windshield. Behind him, the girl coughed into her sleeve and pressed the bundle, now obviously a gasping dog, into her belly to muffle its panic. The first stones fell. They weren't the size of fists. The mountain, so far, wasn't throwing its heart. It was spitting the skin of its throat, but they were heavy enough, small and mean enough, to ricochet off tin roofs like gravel on a drum. In Sagang, under a roof suddenly too thin, people moved by touch. A mother slid her hands along the wall to the shelf where the flashlight lived, only to find it had no batteries. She pulled a candle out of a jelly jar, struck a match. The match died in the ash-thick air. She tried again, cupping the flame, the air tasting sour on her tongue. When the candle finally took, the wax dribbled onto her finger, and she didn't feel it at first. Only when the ash reached into her lungs and made her cough did the sting bloom and remind her she was still a body in a room in a town on the side of a mountain. Sirens cut the dark. Not city sirens, the smaller, urgent yelps of barangay trucks, the kind used when the river swells fast or a landslide blocks a road. The barangay captain's voice, amplified through a loudhailer, shook with a professionalism that didn't hide the quiver beneath. Evacuation? Evacuation. Stay calm. Bring water. Masks if you have them. Keep the children close. Do not enter the 4-kilometer zone. Keep the elderly near the front. He didn't say the part that burned in his chest, that no one understood where the hot clouds would go, that rivers made roads out of ash when they had no water, that instincts could lie in the dark. The currents were moving. In the monitoring room, the seismic line surged and then tapered into a thinner, coarser thread, the kind that suggested not just steam but heavier material, small collapses within the plume. The staff called the Provincial Disaster Office. They were already on the line, maps spread, the heavy paper shining under LED lamps. The head of the office ran a finger down the channels he knew. Gullies opening onto the southern flank, ravines where hot air would move like a flood. He imagined the places he'd walked in dry season, when the rocks were cool and crumbled under his boots. Now those places might channel heat he couldn't stand near. A soldier in a thin raincoat stood at a checkpoint where the asphalt turned to mountain. He tugged the hazard tape and tightened the knot around a signpost. He had never seen the crater so alive. His orders were to stop anyone who tried to go up, to wave down the men who always go closer when everyone else goes away. The riders on big bikes who wanted to touch the edge of danger, the drone hobbyists, the ones whose confidence rode a step ahead of their knowledge. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and coughed into the crook of his elbow. The ash buried itself in the folds of his uniform. Someone screamed the mountain's name like it needed to be reminded it was a god with duties to men. In La Castellana, where the streetlights flickered and died in an uneven cascade, the mayor navigated a pickup through neighborhoods he had known since boyhood, honking at corners, thumbs up through the window at men with sacks on their backs. He could see only a few meters ahead at a time. The ash was thick enough now to muffle the usual sound of tricycles, make the town an underwater place. He tried to remember whether the evacuation center's doors had new locks or the old ones, if the generator had been tested last week or not. A call cut through with static. The evacuation building's caretaker shouted over the interference. Water drums were in place. Masks were short. Children were crying. The old men were laughing too loudly, the sounds of fear dressed as jokes. Up at the crater, incandescent stones snapped off and fell back into the cauldron in luminous arcs. Volcanic lightning sprayed and then threaded into silence. The column was a fist now, punching a hole into high air, flattening out, creating a mushroom of ash that began to drift on wind the volcano itself conjured. The drifting edge waved over dark towns, and beneath it a breathless quiet took hold, the kind that came not from peace, but from awe and a choking restraint. People put cloth to their faces, shirts, pillowcases, anything. In one house, a grandfather put a folded barong over his mouth, the garment keeping some threat from getting all the way in. He thought of the old method. Sit with your head between your knees and count to 100. There was nothing to count that made sense to him now. He counted anyway. On a road that usually held a dozen motorbikes and a couple of stray dogs, the ash began to pile. 2 centimeters is not much until every step carries it into houses and lungs. A child in slippers skidded, went down on her palms, stood up with gray prints, and eyes suddenly panicked. She could not see the mountain for the mountain's breath. She asked her father if this was smoke or cloud. He said both, a knock, both, and scooped her up. His voice was sturdy. His legs shook. Down a ravine, a dark current hissed through ferns that crumpled at its touch. It wasn't glowing like in the movies, just a deeper night on the ground. Air so hot it could strip a forest from its slope without a flame. It moved faster than a man could run, and slower than the fear it triggered. It held grit and damp and heat like punishment, and it stayed low until it hit a bend and clapped up the walls in a lick, searing bark, leaving behind a tight, harsh scent like boiled pennies and burned hair. The current didn't leap the ridge. It didn't need to. It scoured its appointed channel and fanned out in thin tongues over an older debris field, then halted, its heat dissipating into the coolness of twilight. In a classroom turned evacuation ward, with saints smiling down from curling posters, people laid blankets and plastic mats on the floor. The generator coughed itself awake. A dull light limped through the room. A volunteer unrolled a banner that had been used for floods and hurricanes, its words general enough to be useful now. Children were given crayons and told to draw to occupy their hands. Some drew the mountain as a brown triangle under a blue sky. Others smudged gray across the paper until it looked like the view. On the far wall, a woman sprayed the windows with water to catch some of the ash. The spray hissed like a snake. Outside, the mountain paused. It didn't rest. It gathered. The instruments showed the tremor fattening, the line swelling into a darker band. In the ash-choked night, a few brilliant stars cut through on either side of the plume, like eyes watching from the black above. The rain that had threatened earlier arrived in a whisper, beating on ash-dusted leaves, turning gray to darker gray. A policeman took off his cap and held it upside down, letting it fill. He had walked flanks during dry season drills. He had never felt the volcano breathe under rain. The first drops turned furrows into channels, channels into small rills. The mixture made a sound like sugar poured on tin. The soldier at the checkpoint tightened his fingers on the tape and listened. He heard something else under the hiss, deep and rhythmic, something like a crowd stamping feet in a stadium. Armin rolled the trike under the awning of the gymnasium, being used as a shelter, and killed the engine. The sudden quiet struck him like an impact. The girl and her dog disappeared into the rush of bodies. Someone pressed a bottle of water into his hand. He swallowed, and the water tasted like the air, sour, a ghost of sulfur. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and stepped back into the ashfall. He knew his way home by the feel of the road under rubber. He would go back for his father. He would climb if he had to. Behind him, the roar thickened and braided with the rain, and from the mountain came a sound that was neither storm nor quake, something with the blunt insistence of a river finding a new bed and making it its own. The sound did not stop. It grew. The hot wind reached farther down the flanks, a breath with weight, and trees bowed as if recognizing a command. Ash stuck to every surface. The rain turned it into paste that silenced footsteps and burdened leaves until branches snapped under gray, soft explosions in the wet. The mountain coughed, and a second surge came, not taller than the first, but thicker, textured with choking density. Volcanic thunder rolled through the ash cloud, not from the sky, but within the column itself, electrical discharges cracking through the fine dust, invisible until lightning stitched their path. The cloud made its own weather. The ground answered with a long tremble that rattled cups on shelves and sent one last rimshot through the teacups in a kitchen where an old woman stood between the sink and the window with a rosary twisted into her fist. On a slope above La Carlotta, Lena, the mountain guide, stood under a small tin awning and watched the trees lean. She recognized the scent of the eruption, the way you know the smell of pine or diesel. It had a distinct ruin to it. She had carried the weight of 1996 her whole adult life, the memory of an ordinary morning turning into a scream. Back then, the explosion had been sudden, an outlaw act. Today felt different, heavier, longer. She knew the difference between steam throwing old rocks and magma moving, soft and insistent like an ache. She did not know what was rising inside Kanlaon now. No one did, not completely. She only knew she could no more go to the mountain than she could return to the hour before she knew what it could do. In the monitoring room, the head of the shift lifted his radio and kept his voice steady. He used words the public would understand. The eruption was ongoing. The ash was heavy. The wind was pulling it southwest. Pyroclastic density currents had been detected along some channels on the southern slopes. They were watching for changes that would mean something worse, something deeper. They recommended masks. They reminded everyone of the 4-kilometer permanent danger zone and the need to stay out of rivers, ravines, and low-lying areas. He did not say what the team thought about the way the instruments had been whispering for weeks of gas flux rising on days when the clouds lifted, of tilt meters tracking a swelling like breath, of subtle changes that meant the volcano's skin had been stretching. The ash found the lungs of the cows and the goats. The animals swung their heads, eyes rolling. A pig rooted in a yard turned its snout to mud and smeared gray across its length, as if to become cloud itself. Chickens crouched and spread their wings over chicks that did not understand the sky had come down to touch them. Farmers tied cloth around mouths and led beasts into makeshift sheds, stuttering under the weight of wet ash on the roof. In a house near a stream, an old man insisted on going back for a box of medals he had earned in a different crisis, and his granddaughter followed him, their footprints the only marks in gray. The school gymnasium sagged under the noise of breathing. Volunteers moved through the crowd, handing out thin surgical masks, counting, apologizing when they ran out. A nurse organized a queue and tried to speak loud enough and kind enough to cut through panic that moved like its own. Invisible current, touching one person, and then the next, a shiver beneath the skin of order. Children clung to habit and to each other, asking whether the mountain was angry at them or at the sky. A boy with ash in his eyelashes wiped his face with a damp rag and said, solemn as a judge, that mountains got tired too, that this was just coughing. Power stayed out. A few private generators chugged into life in certain houses, small islands of yellow light behind curtains. Somewhere, a karaoke machine tried to live and died. In the darkness, the stars were cut by the rim of the ash cloud, a sharper black thrown against a softer one. The smell of sulfur, of something old and deep rising into rooms where rice had boiled and babies had slept, became a partner to the night air. And then the rain came as if the sky decided it would join, a sudden hard rush that soaked ash and pulled it down. Where water met fresh deposits, the ash changed from floating irritant to moving body. In the ravines, the first small flows thickened. Puddles became thin ribbons tugged in one direction. Those ribbons picked up grit until they had edges. The edges picked up stones. The stones learned to roll and then to collide. The sound became rounder. It was no longer the hiss of spray or the slap of rain on tin. It was a round, low, grinding rhythm, patient and eager at once. Lahar. People in the gym said in low voices that tried to make the word a warning and not a prophecy. Volcanic mudflows that turned streams into roads for ash and rock and water to race downhill. On the hill outside Kanlaon City, a small river that kids crossed on a log in the afternoons rose in an hour as much as it usually did in a day. Its water turned the color of dried cement. The waterline climbed the banks and then went past them, touching grasses that bowed and snapped back once, twice, and then stayed bent. Somewhere upstream, something big a log, a section of bamboo grove, jammed against a smaller bend and forced the new flow to carve sideways into softer ground. The river made a new path with a single decision, and the people in the house that backed onto what had been a yard watched as their yard left. In the municipal office, men and women with hardy faces leaned over maps with goggles around their necks and rain jackets unzipped. Radios clicked and carried truncated phrases like fragments of a dream. Bridge at, evac, water level, blockage, cannot reach. The team leader traced a finger from the crater down the tight V's on the topographic sheets to where they widened into habitations named for saints, birds, stones. He slid a ruler along a river and marked 3 bends with a dull pencil. He told a driver to seat himself and keep the lights low. They were going to see what they could see without being seen by anything bigger than them. The rain ironed the ash down. It pressed it into roofs, into gutters, into the small lips of open windows, into hair and eyelashes. The smell of wet ash was part chalk, part ocean, part rot. In a clearing where kids played basketball, the ring of the court turned into slick clay. The hoop bent under weight it had never been asked to carry. The men who had said they would never leave took one last look at the walls they had painted themselves and picked up the bags they had packed anyway. In the ravine nearest the old coffee trees, a deeper rumble arrived. It was not loud in the way of thunder. It was large, the sound of mass thinking of itself. The lahar thickened into a thing with its own shape, and when it rounded a bend, it crested, not like a wave, but like wet concrete spilling over a lip. It rattled rocks. It lifted boulders bigger than a child. It moved not at the speed of water, but something slower and more inevitable. The kind of movement that held you and moved you, whether you, a rock, a fence, wanted to move. Armin reached his father's house with a cough that felt like it had roots. His father sat on a chair as if he had always been on that chair. He had a wet cloth over his nose. He had put neat twine in his pocket, an old weapon against chaos. He stood, and then he put his hand on the back of the chair to steady himself, because the house itself seemed to sway as a long tremor rolled through the frame. He looked at his son and nodded, and between the look and the nod, there was more language than there was breath. They went out back for one last thing, because there was always one last thing. The framed photo of a woman whose ghost hair would be filled with ash by morning if they left her. As they came back through the kitchen, the window went gray, and then black as the lahar, out of sight but not out of mind, found a lower level to occupy and sent a breath of colder air through the yard. Rain revived and fell harder. Somewhere uphill, unseen, a chunk of the crater rim, over steep and waterlogged, slumped and sloughed into itself. A small collapse that changed where ash fell. A minor geometry rearrangement with consequences below. In the gymnasium, the volunteers closed the doors against the thickening slurry, just as the first line of mud licked at the steps. The people waiting inside turned as one toward the long windows when someone shouted in Bisaya, and then in Filipino, the river, listen," and then everyone fell quiet, because the sound didn't require words or translation. It was the dull rage of a mountain's fresh skin being pulled downhill by gravity and rain, a sound like a crowd rushing one direction at once. The concrete stair shook and the gym doors flexed. The lights flickered as the generator coughed. Someone clasped someone else's hand, not caring that it was dusty and wet and not the hand they usually held. The sound drew closer with the confidence of something arriving and not stopping. It reached the edge of the parking lot and tasted it, pushed against it. It found a lower place near the drainage ditch, and it took that place like a right. When it found the culvert, it entered and packed it and emerged on the other side thicker. The men posted at that corner for that exact reason, posted their bodies there anyway, and formed an angle with sandbags and will. The mud piled and shrugged and pushed, and under it all, the mountain's throat continued its hoarse monologue, everything breathing at once. The gymnasium's concrete lip held. The mud seethed around it, angry water trapped in a maze, not made for it, and then it did what water and ash do. Search for the next low place with patience that looked like malice from the vantage of a doorframe. It found the slope behind the elementary school, ran like batter off a spoon, and sank the basketball court until only the rim's trapezoid over the key was visible, a ghost of geometry in the slurry. The old men on the steps, their mouths covered in wet shirts, picked up the sandbags they had arranged and shuffled them to a new angle, called out adjustments in a cadence they'd learned from typhoons and landslides and memorials. They were old in their years, but younger than the mountain, and that comforted no one. Farther upland, a footbridge quivered. It had been rebuilt 3 times in 20 years, and knew the weight of boys and sacks of rice, and the careful steps of elderly women with baskets. It had never known the slow, implacable shoulder of a lahar. The cables sang in a thin metal voice, and then quavered and snapped with a sound like a twanged guitar string hitting bone. The bridge folded into the mud, paused, tilted sideways, and vanished, a small mortal thing returning to the river's idea of itself. The night had become a place with rules. People could feel but not see. Walk on the right. Do not linger. Keep voices low near the river. Listen for change. The evacuation center had learned its own rituals by now. In one corner, someone stirred a vat of rice while another opened cans and prayed for easy open tabs that would not break their fingers. In another, a boy played a game of cards with a girl using a deck so ash-stained the queen's face was a suggestion rather than a command. At the far end, a nurse washed ash from a volunteer's eyes with a bottle of drinking water, and the volunteer cried in relief and shame and said, "I can see," as if he had been blind, though he had been blind for a breath. On the mountain, the storm wrapped itself around the ash column and made a mad union of elements. Lightning discharged inside and outside the cloud. The rim of the crater collapsed a little more, a reluctant surrender of material that had been holding a geometry older than the current residents of the island. The instruments noted it, a brief change in tremor shape, a little spike in the drumbeat of rock on rock. Inside the monitoring room, the team watched and adjusted models, making weightless decisions on paper that had heavy consequences on asphalt a few kilometers below. They debated when to advise clearing a highway or leaving it open to buy time for a neighborhood to evacuate. On screens, numbers climbed and fell, wind parameters changing, rain intensity shifting, a simulation of a river's next thought. A convoy of 3 trucks moved out of the municipal yard into the still falling ash. The lead truck had a plow fashioned for flood debris, repurposed without question. The headlights made cones that glowed back on ash, defeating themselves as light does in fog. The drivers used muscle memory of the road, the lean of the land, the placement of trees they had known since childhood. At a bend above a creek they couldn't see, they stopped. The road was there, and it wasn't. The surface was unbroken. The mud had not yet sashayed across it, but the culvert had been claimed by the lahar, and beneath the asphalt there was no longer a tunnel, but a packed throat, the hollow given over to weight. The leader stepped out, felt the road flex under him like something pained. He held up a hand they could barely see. They would not cross. They would need to think like water and go around. Inside a house just outside the permanent danger zone, a man knelt on the tiled floor and placed a basin under a leak in the roof, turning ash into paste. The paste slipped into the basin and made a sound like a heavy breath taken through teeth. He thought of his son in the evacuation center, of his mother refusing to leave until the candles had been lifted from the altar one by one and placed in a cardboard box that had shipped television sets to Negros in the 1980s. He thought of all the times he had cursed the mountain for ruining a harvest with a few days of ash, and he thought how he would iron his curses and fold them back into his heart and never look at them if he could only stand at the edge of his yard tomorrow and smell banana leaves again. Just before midnight, a new roar clawed at the mountain's belly. It had a different register, the kind that made the monitoring team stand up as if pulled. The seismic traces thickened, and the slow, steady band of tremor acquired jagged teeth. The plume brightened inside incandescent blocks briefly visible, arcing and falling back within the confines of the crater. A larger collapse rattled the rim. The radio cracked with overlapping voices. A staffer lifted the microphone, saw his own fingers shaking, put it down, and picked it up again. He said in unflinching language that the eruption remained hazardous, that fresh pyroclastic density currents were possible along the usual gullies, that rain-driven lahars were ongoing, that river channels on the southern slopes were dangerous transitways trying to seduce feet and tires. He spoke to people who might already be sleeping upright in plastic chairs, and to those who were listening through their open mouths because their noses hurt. The lahar front, if something so ungainly can have an edge, approached a cluster of houses built with their backs to a stream that seemed so polite in dry season that bridges looked like decorations. The roar acquired a new clattering texture, the sound of bamboo culms trapped and banging their cavities, the sound of corrugated roofing ripped from something and crumpled, the thin, desperate metal cry. A mother woke her children, not with words, but by lifting them one at a time, placing them in slippers, putting their hands on the strap of a small bag each. The grandmother already had the rosary around her wrist, and she already had a grip on the youngest's forearm that would leave bruises like fingerprints. The night had few stars, and the few were dim behind the ash veil. Lanterns bobbed. Downstream, the municipal team with shovels and unspooled sandbags found a place where a single tree stood in the channel, stubbornly rooted, 2 meters thick at least, something that had known typhoons and drought, and the slow, rich anger of termites in summer. The lahar hit the tree, divided around it, and learned 2 new routes out of the same encounter. One route bent toward the drainage ditch that led to the back of the evacuation center. The leader stood still for a fraction of a second that lasted a life, looked at the ditch, looked at the tree, looked at the bags, and made a decision like a prayer. They would dam the ditch. They would make water think twice. He yelled, and they moved, and the lahar rolled, and the tree creaked, and the mountain sent a puff that rattled ash from leaves that had not yet fallen. The rain hardened into sheets. The ash on roofs turned slick. A goat in a yard bleated in a voice humans always think is human, and it was not wrong. The lahar lifted a refrigerator and turned it into a boat with no destination, and the boat banged against a wall and left a smear like a signature. In the monitoring room, someone brought coffee the color of the world outside, and fingers wrapped around cups that warmed knuckles gone white. The wind turned a degree, 2. The ash plume leaned a little. The lightning inside it flickered with less vigor, and then flared again, as if offended by the lull. People felt without seeing the way the mountain's chest rose and fell, the slow animal mechanics of it, the way its long cough paused always a second too long. At the edge of the evacuation center's floodlit entrance, with the light a mere smudge against the ash, the sandbag wall took shape. It squatted like a line of permanent bodies. The municipal leader's face was gray, with ash and water and after. He had a wooden rake braced in the crook of his shoulder to push back what approached. He had voices in his ear, the radio, the men shouting, the children's crying. And he had other voices too, the threaded narrative of his own nights under storms, under governments, under the volcano. The ditch filled and slurped and tried to gulp the sandbag line. It held. The lahar piled and tried to slump over the top, like an animal discovering climbing. The first bag shifted. He shoved it with the rake, and it slumped back, indecisive for 1 second that the men bought with their bodies. The mountain roared again, and inside that sound there was a crack like a stick snapped in two. No, like 100 sticks. Incandescent blocks popped like embers in the mouth of the volcano and tumbled, short arcs that briefly sketched the geometry of the crater's throat for anyone with eyes to see, though no one had eyes that sharp now. The glow pulsed at a slow, stubborn beat, and the cloud strobed, revealing and concealing the same shapes, like a camera cutting between frames. The municipal leader looked at the ditch line, and the tree and the river and the black beyond, and thought, for a single and scandalous second, of sleep. The lahar, remade by a moment's jolt, surged in an angled rush that took it toward the line of sandbags with a new insistence. The men put their backs into it. Somewhere in the gym, a child laughed, unaware, in a way that can stop a heart. The men with rakes and shovels and widened eyes felt the weight come at them all at once, and the roar took over the night. The surge spilled toward the sandbags and met a wall of will hardened by every season this island had ever endured. It rose, reached greasy fingers over the top, and seemed about to tip, and then the ditch, clogged till the last grudging moment, surrendered and took the weight sideways, letting the mass slip out along the road that ran parallel to the center. The mud, insulted, flung a tongue at the steps, coating them and stopping just below the door. The leader's rake clanged on the concrete as he exhaled and did not know he had been holding his breath for a minute that had stretched to a life. The men sagged, laughed once, the laughter abrupt and unmusical, and then turned back to see what the next minute required. Up the slope, in the houses back to the betraying stream, the lahar reached the posts and pressed with a groan. The mother and grandmother and children moved sideways, like they had practiced in their dream of this, the mother placing a palm flat against the wall to feel the house speak. The mud licked the floor and stopped at the legs of the altar, cradling the box of candles and a picture of a woman whose eyes had seen other gray nights. The grandmother put a finger on the glass of the picture, and then picked up the youngest and stepped into the doorway, into a world of wet ash and shouting and the knowledge that the road had turned into a waiting room for decisions. In the monitoring room, numbers softened. The tremors' thickness thinned. The ash column's shine dulled, and the lightning inside it frayed into smaller threads, and then into occasional glints. The instruments did not say safe. They did not say done. They reported a contraction, the mountains exhale tapering. The rain was now the louder voice, gunning on roofs, filling barrels, urging lahars to finish what they had started, to find whatever low places had been missed, and occupy them before hunger was satisfied. A staffer lifted the radio and spoke with a voice that allowed relief in its edges, and no complacency in its center. The eruption was waning, but hazards remained. Lahars would continue as long as rain teased the ash down. River channels were highways for everything that wanted down, and the permanent danger zone was not a suggestion. The first birds checked the air. It was still night, but they are creatures of thresholds, and they came to the power lines and scraped a few notes into the darkness, as if testing whether song would be recognized. A farmer above La Castellana opened his door and stepped into mud that had put his sandals under the bed for him. He placed his foot in it anyway and felt the suction try to keep him home. He pulled and wobbled and set his weight and began to walk toward a high point where the air might be a little less thick. By dawn, gray turned to a lighter gray and then to a bruised blue. The plume reclined in the wind softer. It had exhaled most of what it wanted to say in the first hours. From the flanks, thin streams of steam rose where new material met old water. The lahar paths were visible now, etched into the slopes like the handwriting of the night. They weren't everywhere. They were specific. A few ravines scoured and filled, a few fields layered in a skin of strange sand that would be, in quieter months, both a curse and a slow gift to soils. The trees along one channel were burned in a ribbon, leaves crisped, trunks etched with dull scorch marks, a reminder of where the pyroclastic currents had swept and strangled and then cooled. In the gymnasium, bodies unstacked themselves from the floor in slow sequences. Children rubbed eyes and found grit. Volunteers brewed coffee in a vast, dented pot that seemed to hold enough comfort for 200 and no one. The municipal leader washed his face with water brought in plastic tubs and watched as gray ran off his skin in authoritative arcs. He reached for the radio, inhaled ash again, and said he was going to walk the road. A nurse took a gentle hold of his elbow and inserted a warning into his stubbornness. He nodded anyway. 2 men followed. They stepped into a morning where the mountain wore a color of cloud and looked domesticated by light and distance. They knew better. They had seen its insomnia. Armin and his father came around the edge of the house and saw the yard unmade. The banana trees had bowed to the ground and stayed there, leaves plastered with ash in a pose like worship. The small shed where the motorcycle had slept had collapsed under the weight, the roof tilting like a hat knocked askew. The old man sat on the step with his elbows on his knees and the wet cloth in his hand. He coughed and then smiled at his son with a sudden, sharp joy that felt like bad timing and also like life. They went to the side of the house and stood for a long time looking at the stream. Now a channel of cement-colored standing water with piles of branches along its edges like eyelashes. On the radio, the familiar voice began the day with what had become familiar advice. Keep masks on. Sweep ash off roofs before rain wakes them beyond tolerance. Avoid river channels until water clears. Do not go into the permanent danger zone, even if the mountain looks at rest. Watch for sediment-laden flows. Expect more small collapses if rain continues. Be patient with roads. It was not a sermon. It was a litany of survival. People listened as they always did, with gratitude salted by fatigue. By mid-morning, the sun briefly burned through, turned the ash glittering on leaves into something almost celebratory. Glitter that cut throats and lungs, lustrous and cruel. In that light, the scars on the flanks were visible as pale tongues licked into green. The old coffee grove had lost its shade. The lava that had not exited as lava had made its passage known by what it had burned or buried. The evacuation center exhaled bodies into streets, and people immediately turned into neighbors, carrying buckets and brooms, distributing water that did not taste like pennies, opening windows to the air, and then rethinking and closing them halfway. By afternoon, lullabies returned to doorways. Trucks with insignia of the province rolled through with water tanks and sacks of rice and bundles of masks that smelled faintly of plastic and oil. Volunteers from the lowlands came up in pairs with long poles and an old sling to knock ash off roofs. Children in shorts and no shoes ran in narrow bands of clear ground their parents had swept, play lines drawn by safety. The mountain could be seen if you tilted your head at a certain angle between two palm fronds. It looked exactly as it always had, which is to say, like the shape of something that determines where clouds go. The thought that it might be done for now took hold and was guarded jealously against the colonizing fear that it was not. On the other side of the island, flights that had been delayed took wing again with reluctance, engines tucking in and lifting dust off the runway like sighs. In conversations that would ripple across the archipelago, people would recall the volcanic lightning, the way it made the ash cloud a living creature, the way the mountain seemed almost tender between rages. They would share videos and argue over dates and post the inevitable, lines about respecting nature, as if respect were an amulet and not a habit of behavior. Someone would pull a photo from the 90s and say, again, that this had happened before, that living beside heat requires memory as much as courage. Scientists would move closer when safe, to sample what the volcano had breathed, to read its souvenirs, grains of ash, almost too fine to be seen, the chemistry of gases, the small sags and rises of land measured by instruments that noticed when the earth inhaled. They would argue in good spirit about whether this eruption was hydrothermal only, or whether deeper magma had moved, about whether the tilt had reset or if pressure remained stored. The labels would matter for forecasting. They would not change the burdensome common truth implied by the lines on paper and in the ground, that the volcano was awake in the way of living things, sometimes amenable, sometimes tempestuous, always alive. Night would come again. Lights would return to most houses. The generator in the gym would quiet at last. The songs that had been put away in fear would come back timidly to lips roughened by ash, lullabies, and pop hits, and prayers. Animals would nose around yard edges, find new smells on old ground, decide the world still contained forage and ritual. On a stoop, a grandmother would hold a rosary and fall asleep with it tangled in her fingers, and her granddaughter would elbow her gently and lay a blanket over her legs, already thinking of the morning and sweeping. already dreaming of rice and fish and a day without the taste of metals in her mouth. Kanlaon would settle into a lull. The instruments would show for a time a diminished restlessness, still simmering, still sighing, still capable of flinging the lid off again without much warning. The agencies would keep the alerts where prudence demanded. The 4-kilometer zone would stay sacred in its exclusion, that little ring around a temper that must be respected. And the people who lived in the mountain's shadow would do what they have always done, because there is no other way to live anywhere in the islands. Keep one eye on the horizon, one ear to the radio, sandbags near, names of neighbors held like passwords, the old stories told by people with ash still in their hair. They would remember 1996, not as an anomaly, but as a lesson carved in gray. They would remember last night with a pinch of salt grabbed between thumb and forefinger and tossed over the shoulder. When the sun returned fully, it touched the burn scar and the glittering ash and made them both beautiful against the mountain's green. The beauty would not trick anyone. It would sit beside fear and something else, the stubborn joy of staying. A volunteer with dust in his stubble would grin at a child who offered him a paper drawing a triangle under a blue sky, a gray cloud above, and small stick people holding hands in a row, and he would tuck it into his pocket like a map. He would climb a ladder with a long pole, can tap the ash from a neighbor's roof. He would descend and drink water that tasted only like water and feel the sweetness of it in his throat. If stories like this move you, subscribe for more true events that changed the world.